Apartheid, meaning apartness in Afrikaans, was a brutal system of institutionalized racial discrimination that held South Africa in its grip for almost 50 years. Established by the ruling National Party in 1948, apartheid sought to separate South Africans based on race and enforce a hierarchy that privileged the white minority over other racial groups. But apartheid was more than just laws. It shaped culture, politics, economics, and the lives of millions. White settlers arrived in South Africa in the 17th century. To create a permanent white majority, they began a long process of land seizure and enforced racial segregation that South Africa would come to be known for, long after those of European descent ceded political power to the black majority in the 1990s. Named for the Afrikaans word for apartheid, meaning apartness, South African apartheid was built on the premise of racial superiority. The ruling National Party implemented apartheid, which led to years of race-based classification exacerbated by white rule and white privilege. While there have been many positive post-apartheid changes, there has also been a backlash including economic instability, political discrimination, and outbursts of lethal violence. From when South Africa became a country in 1910 following the Boer War, black and colored people, whether African, Indian, or mixed race, were classified as inferior. They could not be in the presence of a white person unless that white person worked for them. With apartheid having ended in name only, racism continues to be a part of the daily lives of many in South Africa. Despite this harsh delineation of human worth, South Africans fought back in myriad ways and most essentially by demanding their vote. Once free, fake candidates were ineffective and did little to bring about serious or systemic change. These methods suggest that even under the most challenging circumstances, people will resist authority. Definition and origins, apartheid laws and policies. After their narrow victory in the 1948 general election, the National Party began a steady dismantling of the representative rights of the non-white population. Certain key features of the government edifice were left in place to maintain the impression of self-government for non-whites, but the NP's two-thirds parliamentary majority enabled it to strip away the substance. For example, it removed from the coloured franchise and the Indian franchise all representation in the Senate, and in 1949 made this House a fully racial one in which coloured members would represent only Cape Coloureds and Indians only their community. The voters' roll was compiled in each major group area, and a more strict group area policy was followed. Their opponents cooperated in their own decline in that in 1950 and 1951 they left the Senate and therefore the Constitution under the threat of the addition of further seats to the then all-white Senate under a form of joint political suicide. As power was handed to the executive, parliamentary opposition was curbed. It was made illegal even to advocate openly the altering of the political system, and a host of laws were given retrospective effect to June 1st, 1943 against Indian radicals, many of whom were tried for treason and sedition in 1956 to 61. Although this removal of open political opposition, coupled with the NP's successes of 1948 to 50, made the imposition of apartheid largely unopposed, the FNLA, progressives, Indians, coloureds and liberals in the Cape argued against such treatment of non-whites, who were given limited representation since it was held. They too felt some degree of nationalistic pride, had traditional laws which they cherished, and had long-standing cultural principles. However, their arguments were dismissed. The nature of the ANC also began to change. In South Africa, the pass laws were a unique form of discriminatory legislation designed to freeze the structure of the nation's population in terms of race classification. The pass law system had three main purposes: to regulate non-white labour, to prevent the disorder of the urban areas from spreading to the homeland, and to protect against miscegenation. The legal authority that established and expanded the pass laws was enacted during George VI's reign in the name of the British monarch. The pass laws were a source of much controversy in South Africa after the country gained independence, and the basis for their repeal was evident in the new republic's constitution. However, they were retained, and through a pattern of enforcement designed to ensure political control by a white minority, the injustices they spawned increased the gulf between the political aspirations of the different racial groups in South Africa. From the earliest colonial days, it was usual to set apart areas where black people were allowed to settle. By the last quarter of the last century, an attempt was made to regulate the movement of black people away from their homes by means of a hut tax. As the cost of operating the colonial administration rose, the need for revenue caused a revision of the methods of collection. It was then that the idea of requiring men to carry certificates originated. These documents checked the movement of men, especially from rural areas into townships. Black women were not then affected by the law. The theory of native reserves, which had its origin in the Land Act of 1913, had the effect of denying black people legitimate claims to urban areas and of throwing them into increasing poverty and lawlessness, since they were neither in their tribal areas nor among strangers, where the legal authority of local chiefs might still have some sway over them. The population is controlled in the interest of apartheid by restrictive strategies such as the reservation or segregation of land by population group, the prohibition of ownership or occupation of land or immovable property by persons other than a designated person, and the restriction or prohibition of occupation by people of immovable property. This policy of settlement and housing development led to the displacement of many farmers and families who were forced to leave their land and their homes and migrate to so-called Bantustans or collection settlements. As a result of this historic process of dividing and allocating property, many violations of people's rights have occurred, and the effects of these violations continue to manifest themselves in current conditions. The government is taking powers to regulate the relocation and occupation of these areas, and the concept of group monopoly control is therefore developing. The Group Areas Act imposed strict land controls on people of different population groups. The aim of the law is to use land as a political tool to maintain and strengthen apartheid, protect the special interests of whites, and meet the demands of a highly paid non-white labor force, while the Supreme Court is legally responsible for enforcing the moral and social rights of the individuals concerned in accordance with the constitutional principles and the universality of the Bill of Rights. The statement also provides for a vacancy index, a restriction on access to land and residence, and validates any of the above-mentioned transactions. As racial, economic, and political inequality grew during the 1960s and 1970s, non-whites, primarily Africans, began to resist the system established by the Afrikaner leadership. Protest became organized and extensive, and over time a range of resistance strategies took hold, from strikes and marches to non-violent legal challenges. A significant number of whites also began to question the policies of their government. For years, the arousal of non-whites and the resistance built, confronting white authority with more than it could manage. In 1976, the African National Congress began to form armed resistance and conduct operations. Members of the South African government frequently portrayed opposition as a conspiracy, and the connection between the African National Congress, the Non-White Trade Union Federation, and striking workers seemed to prove the point. At the same time, large non-white organizations opposed connections and ideological direction. Whites outside the government increasingly began to criticize the system, question the strategy of confrontation, and advocate change. The cumulative impact of resistance and pressures for the elimination of institutionalized inequality struck a blow at the confidence of the whites, who, through their elected leadership, had worked for 4 decades to maintain the status quo. The African National Congress, ANC, was formed late in the 19th century by a group of black Africans upset with the British government in South Africa. In 1948, the government, now taken over by Afrikaner nationalists, began to legislate fully in favor of the white minority. While many groups in South Africa actively opposed apartheid, the ANC was recognized internationally as the primary opposition organization, and that eventually allowed it to play a significant role in ending apartheid and influencing the creation of a new South African government. The focus of this paper will reiterate much of this history and cover only in brief the many developments in South Africa since Mandela's release. In Section 3 of this paper, we will further examine some of the economics of apartheid. The ANC demanded specific freedoms such as common land ownership, trade union rights, and the ability to get a better education. For the first 40 years of its existence, the ANC was not very successful, as the government did not take kindly to criticism. Since its foundation, the ANC had declared its opposition to racial prejudice in any form, but in the 1960s, prompted by increasingly harsh treatment by the South African government, it changed direction. The ANC has a large and complex history, but for the purpose of this paper, it is sufficient to say that it now stands for a democratic South Africa with equal opportunity for all. Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement. The Black Consciousness Movement, especially in its more moderate and non-violent form, reached its height of influence in the late 1970s through the leadership and writings of Steve Biko. It was officially launched in 1968 and it spread rapidly within the decade. By the mid-1970s, Black consciousness was the ideology of the student revolt. By 1977, 90 trade union locals had identified themselves as Black consciousness organizations, and the Black People's Convention was formed to coordinate its national resistance. The movement was dedicated to creating a race and colorblind society in South Africa, but it recognized that before this could happen, Black pride and a rejection of one's blackness as something to be ashamed of had to come about first. Only then could people begin to address the present inequities based on race. Black people, they felt, had to identify with each other before they could identify with people from another race and form alliances with them. The status of African people depended entirely on their acceptance of themselves as Black. They were to unite and forge a new identity without reference to the grey areas of the South African community, and to abolish prescription so as to enable Black people to develop themselves. This new identity was to become the basis of a new community spirit. Black people must embrace themselves in racial identity, self-reliance, self-determination, self-respect, self-assertion, self-defense, self-governing, and self-help with or without support they wished, moving into self-responsibility. Between 1958 and 1965, an all-white electorate in South Africa voted to become an independent republic. With an overwhelming majority, the country became a republic on the 31st of May, 1961, despite the opposition of the UN General Assembly. The republic promulgated a new constitution in 1961, with almost the unanimous approval of its white citizens. With the threat of racial integration removed by these changes, and with a declaration of policy on self-government for the non-white people, there followed a period of political inactivity in the General Assembly on the question of the Republic's adherence to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The General Assembly minimized activity in 1961 and did not meet in 1962 to consider the position of the people of South Africa, but a new acting and the manner of the treatment of its population of other races and the situation with respect to racial discrimination continued to be a matter of great concern to other members of the United Nations. Even the admission of Southwest Africa as a non-self-governing territory and the decided opinion of the International Court of Justice did not lessen the concern of the international community about the Republic of South Africa. It was realized that an issue of such nature, where fundamental rights were at stake and infringed, should not be easily set aside. By the 1970s, the South African government could see how world opinion had turned against it. At the United Nations and elsewhere, it became increasingly isolated. Many of its own closest allies began to put public pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. The Soweto uprising of 1976 had enormous consequences for South Africa. Black resistance to the apartheid regime, both within South Africa and among South Africa's exiles around the world, grew. The more the white government resorted to violence and terror, the more the international criticism of South Africa became intense. there was a widespread fear in South Africa of a bloody racial civil war. In response, the white government declared a state of emergency. In 1977, the UN General Assembly asked the International Labour Office to prepare a report on the exploitation of South African workers. At the end of 1977, the General Assembly set up a special committee against apartheid and appealed to all governments to implement a mandatory arms embargo, to start a boycott of South Africa, and to bar South African planes and ships from entering their territory. The dismantling of apartheid came after decades of conflict, including a sustained struggle led by the African National Congress and other clandestine political organizations that worked within South Africa. In 1991, President F.W. de Klerk, then leader of the National Party which had enacted apartheid, lifted the ban on the ANC and released Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for 27 years. The negotiated transfer of power was a peaceful one. Mandela then led a series of constitutional reforms, creating one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. Multiracial elections were held for the first time in 1994, and Mandela became the country's first black president. Quickly, the concept of a rainbow nation was realized as Mandela became a symbol of peace and reconciliation. Racially motivated acts of revenge were the exception, not the rule. For some, the peaceful transition meant that true reconciliation and social justice were not possible, but as pointed out, both are long-term processes. In order to create a society that does not need the label of reconciliation, we have to work harder and for longer. At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, over 21,000 people testified about their experiences during the apartheid years. Both victims and perpetrators could apply for amnesty if the act was seen as a political one and if the truth of the event was revealed. Today, in our country, as in many others in the world, very important discussions on fundamental matters are taking place between white and black people. These discussions will not last for some months and end without changing the situation, the status quo. There will be a sharing of views and a reviewing of the commands and messages in secret and behind locked doors, in circuitous dealings and inside parallel structures, in local exchanges and in international conferences. Proposals will be made, or they will endorse, sponsor and put forward views or advice as to what should be done. All this will not be very easy, but the fact remains that discussions will take place and there will be compromises negotiated. The question that should be put is whether these compromises will bring about necessary changes, the difficult decisions will be taken, and whether a new era where the new man can be developed will dawn. A time for such changes has largely elapsed in South Africa's history. The people have been getting restless to secure their rights in a variety of spheres, and they have also been determined over a long period to secure these rights irrespective of whatever obstacles were placed in their way. No one thought it possible in the 50s that the system would ever really change further, and that black people would, to all intents and purposes, be brought into the central structures from which they have been marginalized. Today, South Africa and the entire world face an exceptional year. The oppressed people of South Africa want to end apartheid, and they are prepared to shake the earth under the feet of the National Party. The idea cherished for many years by the South African government of changing the entire social and political system in South Africa, which changed the complexion of South African society and perverted many of the Christian values, has already made a great degree of progress. The more hardline backbenchers and the more pro-apartheid Democrats were not prepared to consider constructive proposals contained in earlier messages. Incredibly, the African National Congress has changed, but the government is only in the process of doing so, since it is possible that considerable numbers in the National Party can see the reality more effectively and also boast the gumption to take the present crucial steps, the end of apartheid. The country was set on a course that many believed would end in widespread conflict and maybe even civil war. Once the election showed the new government held the popular mandate to rule, President Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu proposed and then endorsed a system of truth and reconciliation commissions, setting aside a democratic process of trials. The world looked at this process with hope at the promise of reconciliation that was slated to be the objective of these commissions rather than retribution or revenge. It was unique, and there was no model that South Africa could follow in its unique goals. While its impact in dealing with victims of human rights abuses during the apartheid era is widely seen as a model for other post-conflict societies to follow to overcome their history, its impact on the psyche and memory of the apartheid-era transgressor is virtually unknown and untested in any other society. All parties to the conflict, however, had to deal with the commissioners who heard the stories of what happened in the past, and they all had to deal with the emphasis on reconciliation over retribution. Some have called it an African solution to an African problem, while other commissioners tried to dismiss the process as one that was similar to the idea of restorative punishment. A conference was held by historians to discuss the movie and its guide in very practical terms, assessing its value and making suggestions as to whether it should be shown and studied in schools, and, if so, at what level of the students' understanding. This report consists of a drafting together of these deliberations. Background information is given on key aspects of the history of South Africa in order to indicate the necessity of teaching the subject at this stage, particularly in terms of the government's decided policy to remove the barriers of the past and of focusing on the last 25 years up to the attainment of majority rule and liberation in 1994. This discussion is employed as a background to matters of content and process in teaching the film and its guide, and the purpose of the guide. Following key objectives and qualities, the approach to reaching these is shown particularly in terms of analyzing and discussing the film. Requirements are suggested as to the teacher's qualifications and training and the general organization of the teaching. Some practical remarks are made as to the manageable use of the guide, particularly in the senior phase. Then come details of the role of the teacher's guide and assessment options. The report concludes with some consideration as to the nature and value of the school subject matter which has emerged. An integral part of making South Africa a new society is social education that erodes racism and promotes tolerance and understanding among all South Africans.
The most negative legacy of the apartheid system is doubtless the social engineering that stripped many people of their rights and dignity. Racism is ingrained in many South Africans' lives and will perhaps remain so for generations. The apartheid system also encouraged whites to think that the exploitation of black people was normal. The resulting social fabric is complex, and relations can be strained. It is important to debate so that the past may be accepted and the future constructed on more solid and healthy premises. The erosion of the apartheid legacy is work that will be accomplished under the banner of the new South African democracy. White scars are also present, and there are sure to be wage disputes, competitions, and fears. The report of the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation suggested the payment of reparations to the former victims of apartheid, mainly black people. However, the beneficiaries of apartheid, namely the governments and the major companies that collaborated with it, reject this proposal because it would be the source of numerous lawsuits and litigations. But the importance of the debate justifies emphasizing that apartheid was an international problem. The European Union voted measures to put an end to this system, and the American Congress voted a law sanctioning any American companies continuing their operations in this country. In short, our historical and intellectual society must again think about the source of this policy to ensure that there is no new apartheid.
The negative impact of the apartheid regime on living standards, the socio-economic environment, education, and income distribution is all too well known. In explaining apartheid, South Africa's traditional customs and entrepreneurial attitudes have frequently received a great deal of attention. But there have been sufficient studies detailing the economic gap and the evident discrimination between blacks and whites that must have mattered. After all, apartness was the very raison d'etre of the regime. There was also considerable evidence of strong preferences in favor of separate development prior to the increase in forced migration that followed the promulgation of the Population Registration Act in 1950. The native laws were similarly directed and at different times and in different ways were ratcheted up along several dimensions that were both material factors and in the manner in which people lived. The evidence clearly leads to the conclusion that socio-economic inequalities can be traced to apartheid's paternalist mission, resulting in the denial of basic human rights, and that these inequalities remained salient and quite substantial. Employment discrimination may have turned the hearts of many racists to profit discrimination by the motivation of economic gain, yet the result has been identical. A large and growing literature exists that attempts to decipher the causes of and the reasons for the high level of inequalities. As in other emerging economies, many countries seeking competent policy advice concerning poverty alleviation, human development, and strategies that encourage entrepreneurial expansion and growth look to South Africa for clues as to the types of policies and institutional arrangements that work best.
Comparative studies. With regard to comparative studies of ethnicity, culture, and race relations, South Africa has been identified as a rich resource for comparative analysis. In a study of ethnicity in South Africa, it was emphasized the importance of that country for the comparative study of ethnicity. In a response, it was commented that there were also other countries that were just as well equipped, or at least eligible, for serving as the basis for a prescriptive understanding of ethnicity and the approach to solving the problems of interethnic relations. Yet, reviewing a number of works dealing with race relations, it was noted that none of the authors had seen fit to pursue comparable work involving comparative analysis. The neglect of the similarities and differences between apartheid and other systems was not uncommon to the literature of a considerable number of countries where race relations were an important issue. An institute has been attempting for several years to organize an international symposium to discuss comparative studies of South Africa. The comparative approach does, however, have substantial obstacles. For example, the politics of Southern Africa are extremely complex and interrelated to make an analysis of any racist system in isolation impossible. Even as far back as 1968, discussing alternatives to South Africa's apartheid, it was made the point that South Africa is not unique in either its substance or in its need for change. Both South Africa's supporters and her detractors are likely to pattern their behavior on the basis that apartheid is unique.
The South African apartheid, from the Afrikaans word meaning apartness, was the calcification of unique racist theories developed by white residents of the country after 1948. These theories helped squash the legitimate racial concerns of the ruling clique, which otherwise would have had to deal with objections both domestically and from abroad. The ruling white materialists, in that sense, were able to pacify their outdated concerns over the growth in the number of Indians and other non-whites. Apartheid policies are unbefitting and offensive to all civilized people, and all those who profess contempt for any race and would support policies of this kind should remember that many of their ancestors were at the less than human status in the eyes of their masters, who no doubt denounced all types of liberation movements from the Spanish, Mexican or French ones here in the Western Hemisphere to the Mandelas of South Africa. And this historical imperative, this demand for understanding one's neighbors, is even more acute now because of the struggle of the overwhelming majority of that country's inhabitants against governmental policies which have taken a form of blank check denial of basic human rights.
The story of apartheid is one of oppression, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. From Sharpeville to Soweto, from Nelson Mandela to everyday South Africans, the people of South Africa fought bravely for their freedom. Apartheid may be over, but its lessons endure. South Africa's journey serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of discrimination and the strength of unity. May we honor the memory of those who fought and continue to work for a world free of prejudice and oppression.